access to it, right? So I'm going to comment this out, and I'm going to come under the button, and I'm going to say this login action, right? All right, so I should explain to you as I go along. So in a few videos before, we talked about, or I mentioned that I've now moved to single action logic, right? So what the single action logic does is there are classes that contains a single logic that deals with stuff like logging in, stuff like logging out, stuff like inserting data within a database, deleting data, updating data, etc., etc. I've got a single action logic class that does all of this. Now, the login action is going to be a local dependency for this actual security controller. So I need to import that in. So I'm going to say use, and that is part of the core framework. So I'm going to say MagmaCore. That is located in the base directory, in the domain directory, and in my actions directory. And what I want is the login action, just like so. I'm going to bring it down into my local dependency, and I'm going to say login action. I'm going to point it to that import that we've just brought in, which is login action : class, just like so. And you can see I'm referencing it by using the this keyword and login action. And these are also chainable methods, and there's a few methods that we have to chain on in order to get the result that we want. So I'm going to go on a new line, and the first method I'm actually going to be calling is the execute method. Now this is the important method in all the in all the single action. They've all got a execute method which does a different execution based on the action that we're calling. Now these execute method takes in quite a few different arguments. They're not all optional. They're not all required. The only two required arguments is, I think, the fourth argument, and I think it's the first argument and the fourth or fifth argument. But we're going to go through them, and we're going to explain what each of these arguments are. So the first argument we're going to be passing in within this execute method is this object operator, if you want to call it something like that. And what this does is provides the current controller object as the first argument to this execute method. And what that's going to be able to do in the core part of the framework is of the ability to sort of like call any of these properties that we've got declared within this particular controller, right? So we're giving it access to the object plus the base controller object as well, so we can pretty much pull whatever method that we want to complete that action, or complete that single action that we've got. So the second argument is, in our case, we're not going to be using it, so we're going to be declaring a null. But what the second argument is the entity. So this particular controller hasn't got an entity for itself, so we put a null. So what the entity is anything. I suppose this possibly could have, because we have got fields, we have got a form on the front, which is going to be filtering the inputs. But because this is a security controller, I've got completely different process which does all sanitization and validation separately. So we're not going to be using the entity, we're just going to be putting null, right? And the third argument is going to be the event that we want to dispatch when we log someone in. We can dispatch an event that we can do various different things with, which we could subscribe to and do a lot of different actions on. we haven't created that event class yet, but I'm going to create it right now. I'm going to pass it in. So just say login action event colon class. So I'm going to create that particular that particular directory and class within my app directory. I'm going to say new directory event, and I'm going to create that file. So it's going to call login action event, and this is essentially how we call our event file. So we say login action event is the last two words that we suffix onto the actual name of our event, right? And within this class, again, we're going to be declaring strict type namespace within the app and within our event directory, just like so. We can just say class, to say login action event, and we want to extend the base action event, right? The base action event is a core class that's in the base directory, and that essentially provides us with three methods that we can populate, that we can then use within our subscriber class, right? So the basic rule for each of these events that we're going to be creating is that we have to set a public constant name, which is the unique identifier of this particular event. So I'm going to say public constant name, and it has to be declared like this. Spell that properly. It's public constant name, right? And how I normally name these events is I go off the namespace and then the name of the class. So the syntax that I go with is app dot event, which is a namespace. Then I say underscore login underscore action underscore event. That is a unique identifier for this particular event. So in different parts of my framework, I can check if that event is firing, and I can conditionally do stuff on that particular event using that particular name. Right? It's a unique name, and every event class that we create has to have a unique name which uniquely identify that particular event. And this is essentially all our event class requires. There's nothing else we need to do to it, purely because the base action event implements the three common methods that we can use within our subscriber class. And I can quickly show you that as well, just to shed some context onto it. If I go into my base, MagmaCore source, and I go to the base directory, and go to the base action event, you can see that when we are dispatching an event, there's three methods that we have to pass to the event constructor, which is going to be the method, context, and the current object, which is defining that event. And we're simply piping those arguments to class properties and returning them as public methods, right? So these are the three methods that we will be able to get access to from our subscriber classes. And we've got the private method, and which we've piped to the argument, and then returning them as public method, right? So base action event, and every event that we create in our app event directory, we're going to be extending that base action event and simply giving our event a unique name, and that's all that is required. Obviously, if there's something unique for that particular event that you want, you can also declare it within that login action event. But for the most part, those three methods, the get context, get object, and get method, is pretty much all you're going to need, because the get context is going to contain any information that your subscriber is going to be using to do other stuff. And the get method contains the name of the method which fires that event, and the get object pretty much contains a copy of the current object which calls that event. For example, it's going to get a copy of this security controller plus the base controller plus all the traits that is imported within that base controller. So we've pretty much got access to everything essentially. Right? So I should pretty much try and show you what this login action look like, so I can pretty much so you can also help me to remember what the actual methods are. So domain action, let's get that login action event. Right? So the login action event, as I was saying, the first is the controller object, the second is the entity object, which is going to be passed in as a string. The third is our event dispatcher. The fourth is our object schema, and these are all strings that we're passing in. But like for example, login action event : class. That's how we pass those in. So the fourth argument we don't actually need, so we're going to be declaring that as null. The fifth argument is the one that I mentioned at the very start, which is a required argument, because this is how we know what method is firing that actual event. And we're also using that fifth argument to do something else, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. So to say method, and that's pretty much how I pass that in, because not only does it contain the name of the class, but it contains the name of the method as well, which fires that particular event. So if we look at the login action again, you can see the fifth argument is the actual method name. Now the sixth argument is an array called rules, and we're not going to be using this just yet. We're going to be using this when we come to building our profile controller, and what this does, it allows us to apply rules to certain routes. So for example, if you're on your profile route and you want to update your password, the rule is going to say that in order to update your password, you must also verify your original password. You must also verify that before the update get processed, right? Just to sort of like an additional layer of security, so no one can come and change your password. They have to know the original password before they can make any sort of like updates to your profile. And additional context is simply any additional information that we want to pass to our event dispatcher. So say for example, we're already automatically dispatching data on all of our events, but if there's something additional that you want to pass as well, we got the option to do that in that execute method, which is going to be the seventh argument. I also believe there's an eighth argument which is not updated on here, but we haven't been using that just yet. I think we will come across it at a later date. So that's pretty much what the login action is doing. We've got the execute method. It contains all the necessary arguments. But before I sort of like explain to you what's going on here, I'm going to finish this controller, this index action, then we're going to print it out and then see what changes, right? So we're going to leave that as that. We're going to say render, right? Now this render method is the same as the view method, and in our previous iteration what we were doing, we were passing in the template, right? And we're passing in the context for the template. But with this new syntax, none of that is required, because this render method is automatically loading the template based on the controller, based on the actual method that it's declared in. Part of the reason why I just mentioned this method, this magic method that we've declared as the fifth argument within that execute method is also helping us to build the actual template that we're using to render for this security index, right? And that's why I was saying, if we go with the convention, it will help us out quite a lot, right? So you notice how I've structured my templates. We've got a client directory, and we've got a home directory for our home controller. For our security controller, we've got a separate directory called security, and we've got the index.html method, which is the actual method that we're calling by default. And if you go with this particular structure, then the render method knows exactly what template that it should display for this particular route, right? But also, if we want to display or go against convention, we can simply pass in the actual template as the first argument, because I've allowed for that as well, right? But by default, it will automatically find a template for us so long as the template exists and we've gone with the convention. So the third method in the chain is the with method. And this is the bit where we apply the context that we want to apply to our template. Now, by default, each of these single action is applying its own context to each template, depending on what method that we're using next. Like, for example, let's just put the next one in the chain. It's going to be a form. So let's just finish it off. End. So I'm going to read it out. So we're saying this login action execute render with a form, and then end, right? So what we're saying, render with a form, we're going to be passing our form object into that form method, and what that's going to do is that's going to provide our template with some context, so we can then call that form within our template. I'm going to show you how exactly what I'm talking about. So to bring it back onto this with method, if we're rendering with a table, then with the table we get a bunch of different contexts automatically injected into our template, so we can use to render different parts of our table. And again, we got a render with singular. So if we're sort of like displaying a singular result, we then get a bunch of context that comes with that singular method within our template, so we can get rows of or get a single row of data, which we can then call all the columns to get the value, right? So and how we pass with the with method, it just allows us to pass additional context that doesn't get passed automatically. So for example, if we've got something else that we want, which we without a doubt is going to have, we can simply declare as the first and only argument, which is an array, and do exactly what we're doing right here. When we were passing that login form, we could pretty much do the same thing within that with method. That's pretty much what it's there for, right? Now the form method, because we're rendering this actual view with a form, we call the form method. If we're rendering with a table, we call the table method, and you will see these as we go along. You're going to see that there changes to reflect what is it we're trying to render. So the form method is going to take in that form object that we build up here, this actual login form, right? And just like how we did it, we say this login form create form. We're not going to be doing that. It doesn't require that. All it requires is the actual property. So we're going to say this login form. That is all it requires. It doesn't need you to do anything else, because internally it's already calling this method, and it's also automatically building the action link or the action path to where this actual form is going to be submitted to, which is going to be on itself, right? Because we've got this execute method. This is where the logic is being applied. So it's executing on itself. And we're still able to display the form, but it only execute once we hit that submit button, right? And we're simply going to end a semicolon at the end. And that's pretty much what the syntax look like. It's mostly what we're going to be using throughout this entire application, because I think it looks a lot cleaner and it's pretty much extendable. So you could add your own actions to a action directory you could create within your app directory. You could reference that action, and once you're extending or implementing the interface, it then provides you with access to all the other methods. So all you will need to do is create your own execute method, follow all the contract, create your own execute method, and create your own logic within that method. And again, what I said, once you're implementing all the correct interfaces, then you then get access to all the other method, which is going to help you render your view to the browser, right? So I'm going to change my screen again, and I'm going to reload, and let's see what surprise awaits us. So I'm going to reload, and you can see we've got no error, but our form has disappeared. Now, the reason why that's disappeared is if I take you back to my editor within my index HTML, which is in my security folder, we're calling it login form, but that's no longer what it's called. By default, when you're using the form within that chainable method, the variable that we need to display the form is simple, going to be called form. That's it. That is the variable that we need to actually display that form. It's what's being passed to us from that that syntax that we've just defined. And I will actually show you where we actually built that and always actually passing that value in. So I'm going to change my screen again, and let's reload and see what we get. And there we go, we get our form again. That's as simple as it is. All right, no errors, nothing like that. It's like nothing's ever changed. But what we have got now is, instead of this basic syntax, we got a much more lovely syntax where we've got absolutely no logic in our controller, because that logic is being handled by a separate class. So we're keeping our controller nice and clean. And the idea behind these single action classes, I know it's not so much for this login action, is with different actions like updating or inserting data, we can pretty much use that logic across any controller that requires inserting, updating, or deleting data. That is the beauty of the actual single action controller, is that we can use that same logic across multiple controllers no matter what, right? So I'm going to now show you a little bit of context, or a little bit of this login action, so you can see the various bits of what it's doing. As I'm saying, the execute method would only ever execute on submit. So once we hit that submit button, that's when this will get processed. So first thing first is that we're checking that our form builder component is set, and we're using a controller variable, which is going to be the first argument within that execute method, which is going to reference this, right? This gives us access to this entire controller, plus gives us access to the base controller on all the methods that's defined, right? Let's close down some of these so I can see what I'm doing. Let's close that. So that's essentially what this is doing. It's checking that our form builder is set. Then we're going to be calling the can handler request, All right. So we're checking that this form is got the right method attached to it. We're checking that the form is submittable using this is submittable method. Right. Right here needs updating, but essentially what this is doing. Remember what I said about our submit button, or we name our submit button. This is what this is doing. This is getting the name of our submit button, because if the name is wrong right here, the form will not submit. So this has to match the name of that submit button in order for this form to be posted. Now, automatically, when we're using the form builder component, every form gets injected with CSRF tokens by default, right? You can turn it off within the form method, within the login form class. We can turn that off, but by default, every form will have the CSRF token, which means we need to check if it's valid before a form also gets submit. If it's not valid, the form will not be submit. Now this bit deals with our login part of the framework. So as I said, we've got different classes that does all the validation, sanitization of the user by checking that password is valid, checking that the username or the user exists or within a database, etc, etc. It does all that for us, and we're simply going to be declaring that this authenticator class, which is part of our core directory, which we have not yet passed in, and that's going to also be a local dependency to our controller class. So we need to bring that in at some point, right? And once we do that, we then get access to it using this controller method again to get access to that property. And once we're in that class, we can call the get validated user, right? And that's pretty much going to validate the inputs from our login form and check that the user is a valid user, right? Once we do that, we get the login, and we're simply going to be checking if the action was true. If the submit was true, meaning if we've got an actual object with that user, then the action is true. Then once that is true, then we're going to be dispatching that event, right? That event is what we passed in from our security controller login action event, which is the third argument within this execute method. And you can see it's the third argument right here. I was simply newing it up, right? New event dispatcher, which is going to create that object, and we're passing in the method, the three arguments that we showed you, that I just showed you in that base action event, which is going to be the method that is calling that event, the context, which is what we're passing right here, and the actual controller object, which is the same controller that we took from the first argument, pass it down to our event. So now our event got access to the current controller object. And we also need that unique identifier, which is the event dispatcher name, right? And we can call that statically because the constant, that's all we call constant in PHP, hyphen with the name that we give the constant, and that's pretty much going to get the unique name for this particular event. So somewhere else in the framework, I could say, as listeners, check if there's a listener exists by this particular name, and I can do something each time that event is fired, right? Now, the context is going to be different for all of our events based on what we're doing. This particular context is getting the user object. So we're getting the authenticated user, and it's going to return all the actual data for that particular user. So we can do some other stuff as well. It's up to you what you want to do with it. You could create logs. You could create log like when that user logged in, when that user logged out. Sky's the limit. You can do whatever you want. and the additional context that we just talked about, where you can pass additional context in, you can see I'm simply just passing it in, checking that it's not empty. If it's empty, we're just going to pass an empty array in, just so we're not getting an error, right? And I also believe you could, the new PHP syntax, where you could do something like question sign, something like that. That will still work, but I'm going to leave it as it was, right? So that's pretty much what the single action class for this, what this login action class is doing. It's pretty much handling all of our login. It's doing all the validation, sanitization, checking, and it's handling that event as well. So we can do different stuff when that event fires. So that's that. So as I'm saying, there's loads more to do within the security controller, and we're going to be cracking on with that